The transport ship Times Meridian Times shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of Kepler 442b, its hull groaning against the alien world's thick, nitrogen-rich air. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her face against the viewport, watching the planet's surface emerge through swirling purple clouds. Below, crystalline spires stretched toward the sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces catching and refracting the light of the system's twin suns. First contact protocol is, in effect, announced Commander Williams over the intercom. Remember, the Zephyrians have been isolated for 3,000 years. Their entire civilization developed without knowledge of other intelligent species. Sarah nodded to herself, checking her translation device one final time. As the ship's xenobiologist and cultural liaison, she would be among the first humans to make contact with an alien species that had never seen the stars beyond their own system. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. The Zephyrians were a fascinating species. Tall and ethereal, with translucent skin that shimmered like oil on water, they had evolved on a world where the dense atmosphere filtered most electromagnetic radiation. Their eyes, while beautiful, could only perceive a narrow band of infrared light. To them, the visible spectrum that humans took for granted simply didn't exist. The landing was smooth, and within hours, Sarah found herself walking through the streets of Lumenspire, the Zephyrian capital. The buildings around her defied human understanding of architecture, seeming to grow from the ground like living things. Every surface was covered in intricate patterns that served as both decoration and communication, readable by touch rather than sight. The Zephyrians themselves moved with a grace that spoke of generations adapting to their unique environment. Their elongated fingers traced the carved symbols on walls as they navigated, reading the city like a three-dimensional book. Their voices carried a musical quality. Their language, a complex symphony of tones and harmonics that the translation device struggled to interpret. Sarah's escort, a tall Zephyrian named Velthara who served as a cultural guide, led her through winding streets toward the center of the city. As they walked, Sarah noticed how the Zephyrians interacted with their environment. Every surface they touched seemed to respond, glowing softly with bioluminescent patterns that provided navigation and information. "Your people must find our world strange," Velthara said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. "We know from your communications that you see things we cannot perceive. Different, not strange." Sarah replied carefully. "Your civilization has achieved remarkable things. The harmony between your architecture and your natural environment is extraordinary." They paused at what appeared to be a public gathering space, where dozens of Zephyrians had assembled around a raised platform. On the platform stood an elderly figure whose skin bore intricate scarification that seemed to tell a story in itself. His voice carried clearly across the square as he spoke. "The Hierophant is telling the old stories," Velthara explained. "Stories of the great darkness that came before our people learned to see the world around them. He speaks of a time when our ancestors were lost and confused, unable to navigate or understand their surroundings." Sarah listened as the translation device worked to interpret the complex narrative. The story spoke of ancient Zephyrians who lived in terror of the world around them, unable to comprehend their environment until they developed their unique form of tactile perception. According to their mythology, this development was a gift from the gods, a divine intervention that saved their species from extinction. The Hierophant teaches that to rely on anything other than the touch sight blessed by the gods is to invite the return of the great darkness. Velthara continued, her tone suggesting some discomfort with the teaching. "Many of our people believe that your arrival, with your strange ability to perceive the forbidden spectrum, represents a test of our faith." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien atmosphere. She was beginning to understand that humanity's arrival might be more disruptive to Zephyrian society than anyone had anticipated. The translation device crackled, and she heard the Hierophant's words more clearly. "The Sky Dwellers claim to see what the gods have hidden." His voice carried an unmistakable tone of condemnation. "They speak of lights beyond light, of colors that do not exist. They would lead us back to the madness of the great darkness, make us doubt the sacred touch sight that preserves our souls." The crowd murmured agreement, their voices creating a low harmonic that seemed to resonate through the crystalline structures around them. Sarah noticed several younger Zephyrians in the crowd who seemed less certain, their postures suggesting doubt or curiosity rather than blind acceptance. After the gathering dispersed, Velthara led Sarah deeper into the city, toward the residential quarters. "There is someone I would like you to meet," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "A young one, whose situation might interest you." They approached a dwelling that seemed smaller and less ornate than others in the area. The bioluminescent patterns on its walls were dimmer, suggesting a household of modest means. Velthara touched a complex sequence on the entrance, and the door dilated open to reveal a warmly lit interior. Inside, Sarah met Kithara, Velthara's younger sister. Even by Zephyrian standards, Kithara was strikingly beautiful, her translucent skin seeming to glow with an inner light. But as Sarah observed her movements, she realized something was different about this young Zephyrian. Kithara moved hesitantly through her own home, her graceful fingers constantly searching for familiar landmarks. When she attempted to read the touch patterns on the walls, her movements were clumsy and uncertain. It became clear that while she possessed the physical ability to touch-see like other Zephyrians, something prevented her from interpreting the tactile information correctly. Kithara was born with what your people might call a disability, Velthara explained quietly. Her neural pathways do not process touch sight as they should. She can feel the patterns, but cannot understand their meaning. In our society, this means she cannot navigate independently, cannot read, cannot participate fully in our community. Sarah watched as Kithara sat in a corner of the room, her posture speaking of resignation and isolation. The young Zephyrian's condition would be considered a severe disability in her own culture. But Sarah's human perspective allowed her to see possibilities that the Zephyrians could not. "Has anyone ever tried alternative methods of communication with her?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. Velthara's expression suggested confusion. What alternative could there be? Touch sight is the only way to truly perceive and understand the world. The Hierophants teach that her condition is either a test of faith or a punishment for some ancestral sin. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the casual cruelty of this explanation. But she forced herself to remain calm. In human culture, we have developed many ways for people with different abilities to perceive and interact with the world. "May I speak with her?" 1. Velthara nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. Sarah approached Kithara slowly, making sure to announce her presence clearly. The young Zephyrian looked up, her infrared-sensitive eyes focusing on Sarah with difficulty. "Hello, Kithara," Sarah said softly through the translation device. "I am Sarah, one of the Sky Dwellers. I understand that you experience the world differently than others of your people." Kithara's response was hesitant, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am broken. Unable to touch-see, as the gods intended. I am a burden to my family and a disappointment to my people." The resignation in the young alien's voice broke Sarah's heart. She knelt down to Kithara's level, careful to move slowly and predictably. "What if I told you that you're not broken? What if the difference in how you perceive the world could actually be a gift?" Kithara's head tilted, confusion evident in her posture. "I do not understand. How can inability be a gift?" Sarah reached into her equipment pack and withdrew a small device, a standard human data pad that she had modified for this mission. The screen could display images in the full visible spectrum, something no Zephyrian had ever experienced. "Kithara, your people believe that only infrared light exists, that the touch sight is the only way to truly perceive reality. But what if I could show you that there's an entire universe of beauty that your people cannot see?" She activated the datapad, and its screen came to life with a simple image. A human sunset, painted in brilliant oranges, reds, and purples. The colors meant nothing to Kithara's infrared vision, but Sarah had another plan. Working quickly, Sarah accessed the device's haptic feedback systems, programming them to translate the visual information into patterns of vibration and texture. She placed Kithara's hands on the device, and immediately the young Zephyrian gasped. "What? What is this?" Kithara whispered, her fingers moving across the device's surface as it translated the sunset into tactile sensations she could understand. This is what humans call a sunset, Sarah explained. It's made of light that your people cannot see, but I've translated it into a form you can perceive. The warm, gentle vibrations represent what we call red light. The cooler, more rapid patterns are orange and yellow. Kithara's expression transformed as she explored the translated image. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing art, beauty, and information in a way that made sense to her unique neurology. Her disability, which had isolated her from Zephyrian society, suddenly became the key to accessing an entirely new realm of human knowledge and culture. There are more? Kithara asked, wonder replacing the resignation in her voice. Thousands, Sarah replied, scrolling through images of Earth's landscapes, human art, and scientific diagrams, each one automatically translated into tactile patterns by the modified device. And this is just the beginning. Velthara watched in amazement as her sister came alive for the first time in years. Kithara was laughing, asking questions, exploring each new image with enthusiasm and intelligence that had been suppressed by her society's limitations. But their moment of joy was interrupted by a commotion outside. Harsh voices carried through the dwelling's walls, and Velthara's expression grew concerned. The Hierophants, she whispered. Someone must have reported your presence here. Through the dwelling's entrance came 3 figures, whose scarification and bearing marked them as high-ranking religious officials. Their leader, a tall Zephyrian with particularly elaborate markings, surveyed the scene with obvious disapproval. Velthara of the Silver Spire, the leader intoned, his voice carrying absolute authority. You have brought the Sky Dweller to corrupt the afflicted one with false perceptions. This is forbidden. Sarah stood slowly, placing herself between the religious officials and Kithara. I mean no disrespect to your beliefs, she said carefully. I was simply sharing knowledge and trying to help. Help? The Hierophant's voice dripped with disdain. You offer false visions, impossible perceptions that exist only in the imagination of Sky Dwellers. The afflicted one's condition is a sacred trust, a reminder that only through proper touch sight can truth be perceived. Kithara, still holding the modified datapad, spoke up with a strength that surprised everyone. But I can perceive truth through this device. I can understand patterns and information that were hidden from me before. Blasphemy, the Hierophant declared. You speak of impossibilities, of lights that do not exist. This Sky Dweller has poisoned your mind with fantasies. The confrontation grew heated as more Zephyrians gathered outside the dwelling. Sarah realized that her simple act of kindness had inadvertently challenged fundamental beliefs that had shaped Zephyrian civilization for millennia. The gift she had given Kithara was not just a tool for personal enrichment, but a window into realities that contradicted everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about the universe. As the crowd outside grew larger and more agitated, Sarah understood that the real conflict was just beginning. The confrontation escalated quickly, as word spread through Lumen Spire's crystalline streets. Within hours, hundreds of Zephyrians had gathered outside Velthara's dwelling, their harmonious voices creating a discordant symphony of argument and debate. The Hierophants had called for Sarah's immediate expulsion from the planet, declaring her presence a contamination that threatened the spiritual purity of their people. Sarah found herself at the center of a theological crisis she had never intended to create. Through the dwelling's walls, she could hear the growing crowd debating whether her ability to perceive the visible spectrum was evidence of divine blessing or demonic corruption. The translation device struggled with the overlapping conversations, creating a cacophony of conflicting interpretations. You must understand, Hierophant Zevtan explained, his voice heavy with the weight of absolute certainty. For 3,000 years, our people have lived in harmony with the divine truth. The great darkness that plagued our ancestors was ended when the gods granted us the gift of touch sight. To suggest that other forms of perception exist is to deny the very foundation of our civilization. Kithara clutched the modified datapad to her chest, her newfound confidence wavering under the pressure of religious condemnation. "But I can feel the patterns," she whispered. "They make sense to me in ways that traditional touch sight never has." "Because your neural pathways are corrupted," another Hierophant interjected. "Your disability makes you susceptible to false perceptions, unable to distinguish between divine truth and sky-dweller illusions." Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. In her mind, she was witnessing a form of systematic oppression disguised as religious doctrine. "With respect, your interpretation of Kithara's condition is based on incomplete understanding. In human civilization, we have learned that diversity in perception often leads to breakthrough discoveries and new forms of beauty." And applies. Human civilization, Zevtan repeated, his tone making the words sound like a curse. "Your people have lived among the stars, abandoning the solid ground that provides truth. Is it any wonder that you have lost the ability to perceive reality correctly?" The debate was interrupted by the arrival of someone Sarah had not expected: Archon Methys, the highest-ranking leader of the Zephyrian civilization. Unlike the Hierophants, whose authority was purely religious, the Archon served as both temporal ruler and spiritual guide. Her appearance at this small dwelling sent ripples of surprise through the gathered crowd. Methys was ancient even by Zephyrian standards, her translucent skin bearing the marks of centuries of accumulated wisdom. Her scarification told the story of her people's greatest achievements, and her presence commanded immediate respect from all present. When she spoke, even the Hierophants fell silent. "I have come to witness this miracle for myself," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of ages. "Show me, Sky Dweller, what you have given to our afflicted child." Sarah looked to Kithara, who nodded with determination despite her obvious fear. Together, they demonstrated the modified datapad, showing the Archon how visual information could be translated into tactile patterns that Kithara could understand and interpret. The Archon watched in silence as Kithara navigated through images of distant worlds, human art, and scientific diagrams. The young Zephyrian had already learned to recognize patterns representing different colors, textures, and forms of composition. Her natural intelligence, previously constrained by her society's limitations, was flowering as she discovered new ways to perceive and understand information. "Remarkable," the Archon murmured, her ancient fingers tracing the air as if following invisible patterns. "The child processes these translated perceptions with greater accuracy than many can achieve with traditional touch sight." Hierophant Zevtan stepped forward, his posture radiating disapproval. "Archon, surely you cannot endorse this corruption of sacred truth. The Sky Dweller offers false perceptions that lead away from divine understanding." "And yet," the Archon replied thoughtfully, "consider the possibility that divine truth might be larger than our current understanding. Our ancestors developed touch sight to navigate their world. But what if the universe contains realities beyond what our senses can perceive?" This suggestion sent shockwaves through the assembled Hierophants. The idea that their understanding of divine truth might be incomplete challenged the very core of their religious authority. Several began speaking at once, their voices rising in protest. But the Archon raised her hand for silence. "I propose a test," she announced. "Let the Sky Dweller demonstrate the practical value of these alternative perceptions. If her knowledge can solve problems that our traditional methods cannot, then perhaps we should consider that truth has many forms." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "What kind of test did you have in mind, Archon?" "Our city faces a crisis that our greatest minds have been unable to resolve," Methys explained. "The crystal formations that power our technology have been failing in patterns our scientists cannot understand. The touch sight readings show no abnormalities, yet the power fluctuations continue to destabilize our infrastructure." This was news to Sarah, though it explained some of the dimmer bioluminescent patterns she had noticed in certain districts of the city. "May I examine your power crystals using human sensing equipment?" The Archon nodded. "You have one day to solve what our best minds have struggled with for months. If you succeed, we will consider that your alternative perceptions have value. If you fail, you must leave our world and take your corrupting influence with you. The stakes could not have been higher. Sarah realized that she was not just trying to help one young alien girl anymore. She was defending humanity's right to exist in this corner of the galaxy. The Zephyrians' reaction to her failure would likely influence their broader relationship with all human civilization. Accompanied by Kithara, Velthara, and a small group of Zephyrian scientists, Sarah traveled to the power generation complex at the heart of Lumenspire. The facility was a marvel of biotechnological engineering, with massive crystal formations that had grown into precisely designed shapes over centuries of careful cultivation. The crystals themselves were beautiful beyond human comprehension, their surfaces covered in fractal patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things. They hummed with energy that Sarah's instruments detected across multiple spectrums, from infrared through visible light and into ultraviolet frequencies that the Zephyrians could not perceive. Our readings show that the crystals are functioning within normal parameters, explained Sivith, the facility's chief engineer. The harmonic resonance patterns match historical records, and the energy output remains consistent with projections. But Sarah's human equipment told a different story. When she examined the crystals using full-spectrum analysis, she discovered irregularities that the Zephyrians' infrared-limited instruments could not detect. The crystals were indeed functioning normally in the infrared range, but in the visible and ultraviolet spectrums, they showed signs of severe stress. Kithara, Sarah called. Can you help me translate these readings into patterns you can interpret? Working together, they used the modified datapad to convert Sarah's electromagnetic readings into tactile information that Kithara could understand. The young Zephyrian's unique neurology, which prevented her from processing traditional touch sight correctly, proved perfectly suited for interpreting these new forms of translated data. The patterns are wrong, Kithara announced after studying the translated readings. There are gaps and inconsistencies that don't match the harmony we should expect from healthy crystals. Sarah's instruments revealed the source of the problem. Cosmic radiation from a distant stellar event was bombarding the crystals with high-energy particles in frequencies the Zephyrians could not detect. Over time, this radiation was creating microscopic fractures in the crystal structure, fractures that were invisible to infrared examination, but clearly visible in ultraviolet light. The damage is cumulative, Sarah explained to the assembled scientists. Each exposure to this cosmic radiation weakens the crystal matrix a little more. Eventually, they'll fail completely. But the degradation occurs in electromagnetic frequencies your people cannot perceive. The revelation stunned the Zephyrian scientists. Their entire understanding of their technology was based on infrared perception, and they had never considered that important processes might occur in other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. But how do we repair the damage if we cannot perceive it? Sivith asked. That's where Kithara's unique abilities become crucial, Sarah replied. I can provide instruments that translate the ultraviolet damage patterns into tactile information she can interpret. With her help, you can guide repair efforts in electromagnetic frequencies you cannot see. Working through the night, Sarah and Kithara developed a repair protocol that combined human technology with Zephyrian bioengineering techniques. Kithara's translated perceptions allowed the repair teams to identify and address damage in the ultraviolet spectrum, while Sarah's instruments provided real-time feedback on the effectiveness of their efforts. The breakthrough came just as the twin suns began to rise over Lumenspire. The repaired crystals hummed with renewed strength, their energy output stabilizing for the first time in months. The city's bioluminescent systems brightened noticeably, and the power fluctuations that had plagued the infrastructure ceased entirely. Word of the successful repair spread quickly through the city, but the implications were even more significant than the technical achievement. Kithara, the young Zephyrian who had been considered disabled and afflicted, had proven essential to solving a crisis that traditional methods could not address. Her unique neurology, previously seen as a disability, had become the key to saving her people's technological infrastructure. But as Sarah and Kithara returned to the city center, they found the Hierophants waiting for them with expressions of barely controlled fury. Despite the obvious success of their collaboration, the religious leaders seemed more determined than ever to reject the implications of what had been achieved. "Tricks and illusions," Hierophant Zevtan declared, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "The Sky Dweller has used false perceptions to create the appearance of success. But at what cost to our spiritual integrity?" The crowd that had gathered was larger than before, and Sarah could sense the tension building toward a breaking point. The success of the crystal repair had convinced many younger Zephyrians that human knowledge had value, but it had only strengthened the determination of traditionalists to reject any challenge to their established beliefs. Archon Methys stepped forward, her ancient face bearing an expression of deep contemplation. The entire crowd fell silent, waiting for her judgment on the test that would determine not just Sarah's fate, but potentially the future relationship between humanity and Zephyrian civilization. "The test has been completed," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. "The question before us now is not whether the Sky Dweller's knowledge has practical value, but whether we have the wisdom to accept truths that challenge our preconceptions." The Archon's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that the real battle was just beginning. The success of the crystal repair had proven the value of alternative perceptions, but it had also forced Zephyrian society to confront fundamental questions about the nature of truth, faith, and the limits of their own understanding. The great assembly hall of Lumenspire had never hosted such a momentous debate. Thousands of Zephyrians filled the crystalline amphitheater, their bioluminescent communications creating patterns of light that rippled across the walls like aurora. At the center of it all stood Sarah, Kythara, and the leadership of an entire civilization, wrestling with questions that would reshape their understanding of reality itself. Archon Methys had called for a formal theological council, inviting speakers from every level of Zephyrian society to voice their perspectives on the crisis that humanity's arrival had precipitated. The success of the crystal repair could not be denied, but its implications threatened to undermine 3 millennia of religious doctrine. "The evidence before us is clear," announced Siveth, the chief engineer whose crystals had been saved by human technology. "The Sky Dweller's instruments perceive realities that our traditional methods cannot detect. Without this knowledge, our power systems would have eventually failed completely." His words sparked immediate opposition from the Hierophant faction. "Technical success achieved through spiritual corruption," Zevtan countered, his voice resonating through the chamber. "What profit is there in saving our crystals if we lose our souls in the process?" But something had changed in the days since the repair. Younger Zephyrians who had witnessed Kythara's transformation were no longer willing to accept traditional explanations without question. A scientist named Raithra stepped forward, her scarification marking her as a mid-level researcher. "I have worked with crystals my entire life," she declared. "I thought I understood their nature completely, but the Sky Dweller has shown me that my perceptions, however refined, captured only a fraction of reality. How can we call ourselves seekers of truth if we refuse to acknowledge truths that contradict our preconceptions?" Her words were echoed by others throughout the assembly. Engineers who had struggled with inexplicable equipment failures, artists who sensed there might be forms of beauty beyond their perception, young Zephyrians who dreamed of understanding the universe beyond their world's boundaries. A movement was building, one that the Hierophants could no longer control through religious authority alone. Sarah watched the proceedings with growing amazement. What had started as a simple act of kindness toward one disabled girl had evolved into a civilization-wide examination of the nature of knowledge, faith, and truth. The modified datapad she had given Kythara had become a symbol of possibilities beyond traditional understanding. Kythara herself had become something unprecedented in Zephyrian society. A disabled individual who possessed abilities that the able-bodied lacked. Her unique neurology, which prevented her from processing traditional touch sight, made her ideally suited to interpret translated electromagnetic data. She had gone from social outcast to essential contributor in a matter of days. "I was taught that my inability to touch-see properly marked me as broken, worthless to my people," Kythara testified when called to speak. But the Sky Dweller showed me that difference does not mean deficiency. My brain processes information in ways that others cannot, and this difference has value. Her testimony profoundly affected the assembled crowd. Many Zephyrians had family members or friends with various disabilities, individuals who had been marginalized by a society that demanded conformity to narrow perceptual norms. Kithara's transformation suggested that their social outcasts might possess unrealized potential. But Hierophant Zevtan was not ready to concede defeat. "You speak of value in difference," he addressed Kithara directly. "But you ignore the fundamental spiritual principle at stake. Our ancestors lived in terror and confusion until the gods granted them the gift of touch sight. To abandon this sacred perception in favor of alien technologies is to invite the return of the Great Darkness. What if the Great Darkness was not what we believed it to be?" The question came from an unexpected source. Elderly historian Pilthek, whose knowledge of ancient texts was considered unparalleled. His intervention sent ripples of surprise through the assembly. "The oldest texts speak of our ancestors' struggles," Pilthek continued, his voice carrying the weight of profound scholarship. "They describe beings who were lost, unable to navigate their world or understand their place in it. But what if their struggle was not spiritual blindness, but simply a lack of knowledge about their own capabilities?" The historian's words opened a new dimension to the debate. If the Great Darkness had been a period of ignorance rather than divine punishment, then the development of touch sight represented discovery rather than divine intervention. And if touch sight was discovered knowledge rather than sacred gift, then other forms of perception might also be valid paths to understanding. Sarah realized that Pilthek was offering Zephyrian society a way to accept new knowledge without completely abandoning their cultural identity. The framework of discovery rather than divine revelation allowed for the possibility that truth could be expanded without negating previous achievements. "The Sky Dweller has not asked us to abandon touch sight," Pilthek pointed out. "She has simply demonstrated that reality extends beyond our current perceptions. Just as our ancestors learned to touch-see their world, perhaps we can learn to perceive-see the universe." This reframing of the issue began to shift the tenor of the debate. Instead of choosing between faith and science, tradition and innovation, the Zephyrians could see the human knowledge as an expansion of their existing capabilities rather than a replacement for them. Archon Methys, who had remained silent throughout much of the debate, finally stood to address the assembly. Her presence commanded immediate attention, and the vast chamber fell silent in anticipation of her judgment. "I have lived through many changes in our civilization," she began, her voice carrying the authority of centuries. "I have seen technologies develop, social structures evolve, and understanding deepen. In each case, progress required the courage to question assumptions and embrace new possibilities." She turned to face Sarah directly. "Sky Dweller, your people have given us a gift, more precious than you may realize. Not just the knowledge of electromagnetic spectrums beyond our perception, but the recognition that our understanding of reality is incomplete." Then she faced Kithara. "And you, child who was considered afflicted, have become our bridge between old knowledge and new understanding. Your unique abilities have shown us that diversity of perception strengthens rather than weakens our civilization." The Archon's words carried tremendous weight, but Sarah knew that the real decision lay with the people themselves. Religious authority could be overruled, political decisions could be reversed, but a society's fundamental beliefs could only be changed by the collective will of its members. The formal debate concluded, but the real discussions continued in smaller groups throughout the city. Sarah found herself invited to countless gatherings where Zephyrians asked endless questions about human society, technology, and philosophy. They were particularly fascinated by humanity's approach to diversity and inclusion, concepts that had been foreign to their conformist culture. Kithara became a celebrity of sorts, sought out by young Zephyrians who wanted to learn about alternative forms of perception. The modified datapad had been reverse-engineered by Zephyrian scientists, who were working to create their own devices for translating electromagnetic information into tactile patterns. But the most significant change was subtle and ongoing. Zephyrian society was learning to value different perspectives, to see diversity as a source of strength, rather than a mark of imperfection. The rigid social hierarchies that had dominated their civilization for millennia were beginning to soften as they recognized that valuable insights could come from unexpected sources. 3 months after the initial crisis, Sarah stood in the same public square where she had first encountered Hierophant Zevtan's condemnation. But the scene was dramatically different now. Kithara was there, no longer isolated and ashamed, but surrounded by friends and colleagues who valued her unique abilities. She was leading a research team developing new applications for electromagnetic perception, bridging the gap between human technology and Zephyrian bioengineering. The Hierophants had not disappeared, but their absolute authority had been challenged and diminished. Some, like Zevtan, remained bitter opponents of change, preaching to increasingly small congregations about the corruption of sacred traditions. But others had found ways to incorporate new knowledge into their spiritual frameworks, teaching that divine truth was vast enough to encompass discoveries that expanded understanding. Velthara approached Sarah as the human prepared for her departure. The research exchange program had been extended, but Sarah's role as first contact specialist was complete. Other humans would come to continue the work of building bridges between the civilizations. "My sister wanted me to give you this," Velthara said, handing Sarah a small crystal sculpture. The piece was exquisitely carved, its fractal surfaces designed to be beautiful both to touch sight and to visual perception. It represented a new form of art that combined Zephyrian aesthetics with human understanding of the electromagnetic spectrum. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, genuinely moved by the gift. "But more than that, it represents something neither of our peoples could have created alone." Kithara joined them, her confidence and joy a stark contrast to the frightened, isolated young alien Sarah had first met. "The device you gave me changed everything," she said through the translation device. "But the real gift was showing me that being different could be valuable." Sarah looked around the square, watching as Zephyrians and humans worked together on projects that would have been impossible for either species alone. Young Zephyrians were learning to interpret translated electromagnetic data, while human researchers were developing new applications for touch-sight technology. "The gift was never just the device," Sarah replied. "It was the recognition that every perspective has value, that truth is large enough to accommodate many different ways of understanding reality." As Sarah's transport lifted off from the crystal spires of Lumenspire, she reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a simple act of compassion. A human's gift to a disabled alien girl had sparked a revolution in Zephyrian society, challenging them to expand their understanding of truth and reality. But perhaps more importantly, it had demonstrated the fundamental principle that had driven humanity to the stars: that diversity of thought and perspective was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated. Different minds approaching the same problems from unique angles could achieve solutions that no single perspective could discover alone. The battle between faith and truth had resolved into something neither side had expected: the recognition that both could coexist and even strengthen each other when approached with humility and openness to growth. The Zephyrians had not abandoned their spiritual traditions, but had expanded them to encompass a larger universe of possibilities. And at the heart of it all was Kithara, the young alien girl whose disability had become her greatest strength, whose difference had made all the difference. She had become living proof that value and ability could not be judged by conformity to narrow standards, and that the most profound discoveries often came from the most unexpected sources. As the transport ship entered hyperspace, carrying Sarah toward her next assignment, she knew that the story of humanity and the Zephyrians was just beginning. They had learned that truth was not diminished by sharing it with others, but multiplied. And in a galaxy full of diverse intelligences and perspectives, that lesson might be the most important gift of all.